What losing taught me that winning never could. Most people think success is what transforms you. That winning somehow unlocks all the confidence and wisdom you've been waiting for. But I've learned it's the losses that change you most. The drawdowns that hollow you out. The red days that make you question everything. The moments when you're staring at the screen, realizing you're not as skilled. Or as in control as you wanted to believe. I didn't know it then, but losing would become the greatest teacher I ever had. It stripped away my illusions. It showed me what I was made of. It forced me to decide whether I really wanted to keep going when nothing was working. This is the story of how losing broke me open. And how it taught me everything winning never could. What you're about to hear is my personal journey, not financial advice. Trading involves risk, and you can lose more than you invest. Always do your own research and never trade money you can't afford to lose. Chapter 1. The first taste of winning. I still remember the first time I closed a trade in profit. It wasn't a lot of money. Barely enough to pay for a nice dinner. But in that moment, it felt enormous. It felt like proof that all the hours I'd spent studying charts and watching videos weren't wasted. Like validation that maybe I really did have something special. I'd never admit it out loud, but part of me believed I was different from everyone else. I thought I could skip the messy part. The drawdowns, the self-doubt, the long stretches of not knowing if I was making progress. I thought I could be one of those people who just got it. And when that first trade closed green, it was like the universe nodding in agreement. I was hooked. The days after that felt electric. Every time I opened my platform, I felt that same charge in my chest. The possibility. The rush of seeing numbers flicker in my favor. Even when the gains were small, they fed something in me I didn't know was starving. The part that wanted to feel capable. Worthy. Like I finally had a way to prove to myself. And maybe to everyone watching. That I was good enough. At the time, I didn't see the danger in that. I thought it was normal to attach so much of my identity to every trade. I thought the high I felt after a win meant I was on the right track. But now I know that first taste of winning planted a seed that would take years to uproot. Because when winning is the only thing that makes you feel okay, losing doesn't just sting. It feels like annihilation. For a little while, though, I didn't think about any of that. I was too busy collecting green days. Too busy imagining how quickly I'd grow my account. Too busy rehearsing the story I'd tell when people asked how I'd made it work so fast. I thought I was building confidence. But really, I was building an addiction to the feeling of being right. And every time I clicked buy or sell, what I was really chasing wasn't profit. It was that surge of certainty that maybe, just maybe, I finally mattered. Looking back, I almost envy that version of me. The optimism. The innocence. The blissful ignorance of what happens when you start to believe your own hype. Because what I didn't understand then was that winning had taught me almost nothing. It hadn't shown me how to manage risk. It hadn't taught me patience or humility. It hadn't prepared me for the days when nothing worked. All it had done was inflate my ego just enough to make the fall hurt even more. That first string of wins felt like a promise. A sign that this path was going to be easier for me than it was for everyone else. But it wasn't a promise. It was a setup. And eventually, the losses came. They always do. And when they did, I discovered something I'd been trying not to see. Winning hadn't made me stronger. It had just made me more attached to an identity I couldn't sustain. I wish I could say I was ready to learn that lesson right away. But I wasn't. Not yet. It would take a lot more losing. And a lot more nights lying awake wondering who I really was without a winning trade to prop me up. To teach me what I needed to know. That the real work wasn't in chasing the high of success. It was in learning how to stand in the quiet, uncomfortable truth of failure and keep going anyway. Chapter 2. When winning became my identity. It didn't take long before winning stopped feeling like a nice surprise and started feeling like something I was entitled to. At first, I would celebrate every green day with disbelief, almost like I'd gotten away with something. But as the profits added up, small, steady, enough to build a sense of momentum, that disbelief turned into expectation. I started to think of myself as a profitable trader. That was the phrase I carried around in my head like a badge. I didn't say it out loud. At least not often. But I felt it every time I logged into my platform. Every time I shared a screenshot with someone. Every time I imagined how I'd look back on this period and tell the story of how I'd figured it all out faster than most. I wish I could say I saw the danger in that. But the truth is, it felt good. It felt better than anything I'd ever done. Trading was the first thing that made me feel special. Different. Important. So I leaned into that feeling. I let it fill up the empty spaces inside me I hadn't even realized were there. The part of me that never felt good enough. The part that needed something. Anything. To point to as evidence that I mattered. When I had a winning day, I felt alive. Confident. Almost invincible. But when I had a losing day, just an ordinary, statistically inevitable red day, I felt like I was disintegrating. It was never just a bad trade. It was proof that maybe all the stories I'd been telling myself were lies. That maybe I wasn't a profitable trader. Maybe I wasn't special. Maybe I was just another person playing pretend with a brokerage account. I didn't talk about this with anyone. I didn't even admit it to myself most of the time. Instead, I'd try to trade my way back to that feeling of certainty. If I could just end the day green, I told myself, I'd be okay again. I'd be allowed to feel proud. Allowed to feel safe. It sounds dramatic when I say it now, but in those moments, it felt like life or death. Like my entire sense of self was hanging on whether a candle closed in profit. That's the thing no one tells you when you start winning early. If you're not careful, success can rot you from the inside. It doesn't teach you resilience. It doesn't teach you perspective. It teaches you to expect the market to keep confirming your worth. And when it doesn't, because it can't, you're left with nothing but the ache of feeling ordinary again. Looking back, I can see that those first wins were the worst thing that could have happened to me. Not because profit is bad, but because it made me believe I'd found an identity that would finally stick. I wasn't ready for what came next. The drawdowns. The strings of losses. The days when no setup worked. Because when your entire sense of who you are depends on being right, the first taste of being wrong feels like the end of the world. If I could go back, I'd tell myself to be humble. To treat every win like a temporary gift instead of a permanent endorsement. To remember that markets don't care who you think you are. But I didn't know that yet. I thought winning meant I'd arrived. I thought I could hold on to that feeling forever. I didn't realize it was just the beginning of a lesson I couldn't avoid. That losing would show me everything I refused to see about myself. And that in the end, it would be the losses. Not the wins. That would make me the trader, and the person I wanted to become. Chapter 3. The day everything changed. It was a Thursday morning when everything started to unravel. I remember it so clearly because it was supposed to be just another ordinary session. Nothing special on the calendar. No major news events. Just me, my charts, and the quiet confidence that I knew what I was doing. That morning, I saw a setup I'd traded a dozen times before. Same pattern. Same entry signal. Same little surge of certainty in my chest. I didn't hesitate. I sized up bigger than usual. Not recklessly, I told myself. Just a little more size to accelerate my progress. Because by then, I believed I was past the stage of taking it slow. I believed I'd earned the right to push. The trade went green immediately. I felt that familiar rush. The confirmation that I was on the right side of the market. But then, just as quickly, the price turned. At first, it was just a pullback. Nothing unusual. I held, telling myself this was noise, that I needed to trust my process. But the pullback didn't stop. It kept sliding, tick by tick, until I was underwater. I felt my heart start to race. My breathing went shallow. It wasn't a catastrophic loss yet. But it was bigger than I was used to seeing. And for the first time, a thought crept in that I didn't want to hear. What if you're wrong? I tried to ignore it. I told myself to be patient. To let the setup play out. But I wasn't calm anymore. I was gripping the edge of my desk, willing the candles to turn back in my favor. When they didn't, something in me cracked. I moved my stop. Just a few ticks. Then a few more. Every rational part of me was screaming to close the trade. But I couldn't do it. Because closing it meant admitting I wasn't who I thought I was. It meant admitting that maybe all those wins weren't proof of mastery. Just luck running out. By the time I finally hit the button, the loss was enormous. Bigger than any single trade I'd ever taken. I remember staring at the number, feeling like the air had been sucked out of the room. I felt sick. I felt exposed. Like every story I'd told about myself had just been proven false in one terrible moment. For the rest of the day, I couldn't think about anything else. I kept replaying it, frame by frame, trying to figure out exactly when I'd lost control. But the truth was, I'd never really had control. I'd just been lucky enough to avoid a moment like this. Until now. That night, lying in bed, I realized something that terrified me. I wasn't afraid of losing the money. I was afraid of losing the identity I'd built around never being wrong. Because if I wasn't the trader who always found a way to win, then who was I? Just another person who couldn't hack it. Just another amateur who thought they were special. It was the first time I considered quitting. Not because I didn't love trading. But because I couldn't stand how fragile it had made me feel. How exposed I was to every swing in price. How quickly one bad trade could turn me into a stranger to myself. I didn't quit. At least not yet. But something in me broke that day. And looking back, I'm glad it did. Because that fracture was the beginning of something more honest. Something more sustainable. The moment I finally had to admit that I didn't know as much as I thought. And that maybe, losing wasn't the enemy I believed it was. Maybe it was the only teacher I'd ever really had. Chapter 4. The Desperate Comeback. The morning after that loss, I woke up with a pit in my stomach. I'd barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same chart, the same red number flashing in my mind. It felt like a verdict. Proof that all my confidence had been built on nothing. Part of me wanted to walk away. To shut down my account, delete the platform, and pretend the whole thing never happened. But another part, the louder part, had only one thought. I have to get it back. I wish I could say I took time to reflect. That I journaled or reviewed my plan. But I didn't do any of that. All I cared about was erasing the loss before it defined me. I told myself it was rational. That recovering quickly would keep my momentum intact. That one good trade would fix everything. But it wasn't rational. It was desperation dressed up as determination. When I logged in, my hands were trembling. Every tick felt like an accusation. Like the market itself was daring me to try again. I ignored my size rules. I ignored my setups. I ignored every boundary I'd claimed to respect. I just needed to feel in control again. The first trade went red almost immediately. I closed it for a small loss, but the feeling in my chest only got worse. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the story I was telling myself. That I wasn't a loser. That I could fix this. That I could force the market to give me back my sense of worth. So I kept trading. One setup after another, most of them half-formed ideas I would have dismissed a week earlier. I watched my balance shrink in real time. But I couldn't stop. Every loss made the next trade feel more necessary. More urgent. Like if I just tried a little harder, I'd find the one that would save me. By the end of the day, I was down more than I'd ever imagined possible. I remember staring at the screen, feeling like I'd fallen into a hole I couldn't climb out of. The worst part wasn't the financial damage. It was how familiar the feeling was. I'd been here before. The shame. The panic. The quiet voice whispering that maybe I was never cut out for this. That night, I sat in the dark with no screens, no charts, no distractions. And I asked myself a question I'd avoided for as long as I'd been trading. Why does losing feel like the end of the world? I didn't have a clean answer. All I knew was that when I lost, it wasn't just money disappearing. It was my identity dissolving. My illusion that I was better than everyone else crumbling. That realization hurt more than the loss itself. Because it meant the problem wasn't the market. It was me. My need to be right. My refusal to accept that sometimes, no matter how hard you try, you're going to be wrong. I wish I could say I learned the lesson that night. But the truth is, it took a long time for the lesson to sink in. A lot more losses. A lot more nights spent feeling like a fraud. But looking back, that desperate comeback was necessary. It was the moment I finally saw the pattern I'd been living in. Win to feel worthy. Lose and scramble to erase the feeling. Never pausing long enough to ask if there was another way. That day didn't break me completely. But it cracked something open. And in that crack, the first flicker of humility began to grow. The smallest understanding that maybe the point wasn't to get it all back. Maybe the point was to learn how to lose without losing myself. Chapter 5. Sitting in the ruins. The day after that desperate string of trades, I didn't open my platform. I couldn't. Just thinking about logging in made my stomach twist. So I sat there, alone in my apartment, surrounded by empty coffee cups and the silence I'd been avoiding for months. It felt like waking up after a storm. Everything was broken. My balance was wrecked. My confidence was gone. And all I could see was the wreckage of the person I'd tried so hard to pretend I was. I wish I could say I felt clarity in that moment. But mostly, I felt hollow. Too tired to be angry. Too ashamed to cry. Too numb to pretend it didn't matter. The losses were just numbers on a screen, but they felt like something deeper. Like proof that I wasn't cut out for this. That maybe I never had been. I spent hours that day replaying every decision. Every time I moved a stop. Every time I sized up out of desperation. Every time I told myself a lie to justify doing what I already knew was reckless. It was all there in the trade history. Undeniable. Unforgiving. I kept scrolling, hoping I'd find something to redeem myself. A clever trade, a moment of discipline. But it was just page after page of the same story. I'd been trying to outrun the feeling of losing by trading faster, clicking more, risking everything. And I'd lost anyway. For the first time, I saw how much I'd built my identity on the idea that I was different. That I was smarter. More disciplined. More destined for success. And in the ruins of that belief, I felt small. Ordinary. Exposed. That night, I didn't try to plan my comeback. I didn't look for a new strategy. I didn't tell myself it would all be fine. I just sat there, letting the truth sink in. I didn't know what I was doing. And pretending I did had cost me everything. It sounds bleak when I say it now. But in that emptiness, something shifted. Because when there's nothing left to protect, no image to uphold, no story to cling to, you finally have space to be honest. And honesty is where real learning starts. I remember sitting on the floor, back against the wall, thinking about the version of me who placed that first trade. How hopeful he was. How certain. How unprepared. I felt an ache in my chest for him. Not just because he was naive, but because he had no idea how much losing was going to teach him. That it wasn't going to be a series of tidy lessons with clear takeaways. It was going to be a slow dismantling of everything he thought he knew. For the first time, I stopped fighting that. I stopped trying to convince myself I was already the trader I wanted to be. And I allowed myself to ask a question I'd been too proud to consider. What if losing isn't proof I'm a failure? What if it's just part of the process I've refused to respect? I didn't have an answer yet. But in that question, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not hope, exactly. Not relief. Just the smallest flicker of curiosity. A sense that maybe, beneath all the wreckage, there was still something worth salvaging. Something I could rebuild. Slowly, humbly, honestly. That was the day I stopped pretending. Stopped performing. Stopped running from the reality that trading isn't about never losing. It's about learning how to sit in the ruins without losing yourself. And deciding, in the quiet that follows, to begin again. Chapter 6. The first honest review. A few days after everything fell apart, I did something I'd never really done before. I opened my trading journal. Not to cherry pick the good trades or look for excuses, but to tell the truth. It was harder than I expected. I'd always treated my journal like a formality, something to fill out so I could feel like I was being disciplined. But I never used it to really look at myself. Not until then. That morning, I sat at my desk with my coffee going cold beside me and started reading through every entry. I thought it would feel productive, maybe even satisfying, like I was finally taking control. But mostly it felt like getting punched in the chest over and over. Every page was the same story in a different disguise. Overconfidence. Impulse. Rationalization. Shame. Repeat. I saw all the ways I'd lied to myself. How I'd called revenge trades opportunity. How I'd labeled reckless size as conviction. How I'd pretended I was calm when my notes were filled with panic and desperation. It was almost embarrassing, seeing it all laid bare in my own handwriting. But it was also the first time I felt real clarity. Because when you finally stop editing the story to protect your ego, you start to see the patterns you've been living inside. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. I remember pausing at one entry in particular. A day when I'd broken every rule I claimed to have. I'd written, just one more trade to get back to even. Reading that line, I felt something tighten in my throat. Because it wasn't just a trading note. It was a confession. A glimpse into the part of me that couldn't stand the feeling of being behind. The part that would rather burn everything down than sit with the discomfort of losing. I kept reading. Page after page. Each one a mirror I'd been too scared to look into. By the time I finished, my eyes were stinging. Not because I was sad. Though I was. But because I finally understood how much of my trading had been driven by fear. Fear of being ordinary. Fear of being exposed as someone who didn't have it all together. Fear of failing in front of an audience I'd mostly imagined. When I closed the journal, I didn't feel better. But I felt honest. And that felt like progress. That afternoon, I started a new notebook. Not to record trades, but to record truths. Things I'd been avoiding. I wrote. I am not my pandal. I am allowed to lose. I don't have to prove anything to anyone. It felt strange, almost childish, to write sentences like that. But in some way, it was the first time I was treating myself like a person instead of a project that needed fixing. I didn't trade for the rest of that week. I didn't research new strategies. I didn't watch videos promising the perfect system. I just sat with the reality that all my chasing had gotten me nowhere. And that maybe the only way forward was to stop hiding behind the idea that I was different. Because I wasn't. I was just another person learning the hardest way possible that trading isn't about feeling smart. It's about feeling everything you don't want to feel. And choosing not to run from it. That first honest review didn't make me profitable. It didn't fix my process overnight. But it was the moment I started telling myself the truth. And in trading, as in life, the truth is the only place you can start rebuilding something real. Chapter 7. The humility of starting over. When you've blown up your account and your ego in the same month, there's only one choice left if you still want to keep going. You have to start over. I don't mean opening a new account and pretending nothing happened. I mean wiping away every illusion, every shortcut, every story about how special you are, and beginning like a complete beginner. It's humbling in a way nothing else is. The first morning I sat down to rebuild, I felt embarrassed. Embarrassed that after all this time, all the late nights and early mornings and half-finished courses, I was back at the very beginning. I opened a blank document and typed in big letters at the top. What do I actually know for sure? I stared at that question for a long time. The list that followed was shorter than I wanted it to be. Most of what I'd believed was knowledge had been ego. The conviction that I was better than the statistics. That I was too smart to fail. That discipline was optional if you had enough talent. I deleted almost every indicator from my charts. I erased all the templates I'd downloaded to feel like I had an edge. I decided if I was going to trade again, it would be with the simplest approach possible. Something I could understand and trust without having to pretend. The first plan I wrote was almost embarrassingly basic. A single setup. One market. Fixed size. No scaling in, no just one more trade, no hero moves. It felt small compared to the complex strategies I'd wrapped myself in before. But for the first time, it felt honest. I set risk limits so tight they made me nervous. A max loss per day that would force me to walk away before the panic set in. I knew part of me would hate those limits. The part that wanted to keep proving I was exceptional. But I also knew that part of me had never helped. That part had only ever gotten me in trouble. When I placed my first trade with that new plan, my hands still shook. Not from excitement, but from the awareness of how fragile my confidence had become. It was a tiny position. A trade most people wouldn't think twice about. But for me, it was everything. Because it was the first time I was trading without pretending. No expectation of glory. No secret hope that this would be the one that made all the losses worthwhile. Just a trade. One risk-defined attempt to practice what I'd promised myself I would. It ended up being a small winner. But it wasn't the profit that mattered. It was how I felt when I closed it. Calm. Grounded. Proud. Not because I'd made money, but because I'd followed my process. That day taught me something I'd been too arrogant to learn before. That real confidence isn't built on results. It's built on keeping promises to yourself when no one is watching. The next few weeks were slow. I traded less. I analyzed more. I wrote down every thought, every impulse, every urge to throw the plan out the window and chase the feeling of being right again. Starting over felt like failure at first. But gradually, it began to feel like freedom. Because there was no reputation to protect anymore. No need to pretend I was an expert. I was just a person learning something hard. And for the first time, that was enough. I wish I could tell you starting over was glamorous or exciting. It wasn't. It was quiet. Unremarkable. The slowest, most uncomfortable process I'd ever chosen. But it was also the first time I'd done it for the right reason. Not to prove anything. Just to see if I could learn. Chapter 8. The temptation to prove myself again. Starting over gave me clarity, but it didn't erase my old patterns. I'd love to say that once I committed to a simpler, humbler process, I never felt the urge to prove myself again. But that would be a lie. Because the truth is, the temptation never really went away. It just changed shape. In those first weeks of rebuilding, I had days when I followed my plan perfectly. I took small, careful trades. I respected my stops. I logged everything. And when I looked at my journal, I felt a quiet sense of pride. But then there were other days. Days when I woke up with that familiar tightness in my chest. The old voice in my head whispering that if I really wanted to redeem myself, I needed to do something big. Something impressive. Something that would erase all the losses in one stroke and prove that I was still special. That voice was subtle. It didn't sound reckless. It sounded reasonable. You've been so disciplined lately. Don't you deserve to size up a little? If you catch the right move, you could get back to break even today. One big trade wouldn't hurt. You've learned your lesson by now. I wish I could tell you I ignored that voice every time. I didn't. There were days I slipped. Days I doubled my size without updating my plan. Days I took trades that were more about ego than edge. And every time, the market reminded me that it doesn't care how badly you want to be right. I'd close the platform with my stomach in knots, wondering why I kept repeating the same mistakes. But here's what changed. This time, I didn't lie to myself about what was happening. I didn't pretend it was the market's fault. I didn't rewrite the narrative to protect my pride. I called it what it was. An old addiction resurfacing. The addiction to being seen as talented. To proving, to myself and everyone else, that I was more than the string of losses behind me. One morning, after a day when I'd broken every rule I'd promised to keep, I sat with my journal open and wrote something that felt almost too raw to admit. I still think that winning will make me whole again. Seeing that sentence in black and white made my chest ache. Because it was the truth I'd been circling for months. I didn't just want profit. I wanted redemption. I wanted a storyline where all my mistakes were justified by a triumphant ending. But the market doesn't care about redemption arcs. It only cares about discipline. About math. About probabilities. I realized then that if I was ever going to be consistent, I had to let go of the idea that trading would save me from the parts of myself I didn't like. It couldn't. No amount of winning would make me feel permanently worthy. No profit target would silence the insecurity forever. That was the hardest lesson of all. Because it meant the work wasn't just in refining my strategy. It was in accepting that trading is never going to fill the holes I hadn't learned to fill on my own. From that day forward, every time I felt the urge to prove myself, I paused. Not always for long. Sometimes just for a few seconds. Long enough to ask myself the one question that had become my anchor. Are you trading to execute your plan, or to feel like you matter? Some days, the answer was still uncomfortable. But every time I chose honesty over impulse, I got a little stronger. A little more grounded. A little less enslaved to the fantasy that one perfect trade could fix everything. Learning to resist the temptation to prove myself wasn't something I mastered overnight. It was something I practiced, over and over, until it became a habit. And slowly, I started to feel free. Not because I'd conquered every flaw, but because I was finally willing to see them without flinching. Chapter 9. Learning to respect small wins. There was a time when a small win felt like nothing to me. If it wasn't big, if it didn't prove something dramatic, I dismissed it as irrelevant. I'd close a trade with a modest profit and feel almost annoyed, like I'd wasted time when I could have been swinging for something grander. That mindset was what kept me trapped for so long. Because no matter how much progress I made, it never felt like enough. When I started over, I knew I had to change that. I didn't just need new rules or tighter risk limits. I needed a new relationship to progress itself. One that wasn't rooted in all or nothing thinking. One that didn't demand every day end in triumph. The first time I closed a trade for a tiny gain. A handful of ticks, barely a blip in the account. I felt the old frustration rising in my chest. The voice that said, "What's the point of this? You're never going to get anywhere taking crumbs." But I didn't let that voice take over. Instead, I sat there and made myself look at the trade in my journal. Was it planned? Yes. Was the risk defined? Yes. Did I respect my stop and take profit where I'd intended? Yes. I realized that by every measure that actually mattered, it was a perfect trade. Not because of the outcome, but because of the execution. It was unsettling to see how much my ego still wanted to turn it into a failure. How quickly I dismissed good discipline simply because it didn't give me a rush. That was when it hit me that winning, in the way I defined it, had always been about ego. It was never about consistency or sustainability. It was about proving I was exceptional. I decided then that if I was ever going to have a chance at long-term success, I had to learn to respect small wins. To celebrate them, even when they didn't feel exciting. Especially when they didn't feel exciting. Because that was the point. If trading was going to be my profession, I needed to treat it like one. And no professional judges their worth by whether every day ends with fireworks. I started a ritual. Every time I closed a small, planned trade in profit, I'd write a sentence in my journal. This is enough. At first, it felt forced. A kind of fake gratitude I wasn't sure I believed. But over time, it started to feel true. I began to see how those small wins stacked up. How they slowly repaired my confidence in a way no single giant trade ever could. One afternoon, after a string of unremarkable days, I added up the week's results. It wasn't spectacular. It wasn't something I'd brag about. But it was positive. And more importantly, it was consistent. For the first time, I felt a flicker of pride that wasn't tied to ego. It was pride in my process. Pride in showing up every day and doing exactly what I said I would do. I realized then that respecting small wins was about more than discipline. It was about humility. About accepting that trading isn't supposed to feel like a movie. It's supposed to feel like work. Quiet, sometimes boring work that pays off over time if you let it. The more I practiced that mindset, the less urgency I felt. I stopped needing every trade to be a redemption arc. I stopped chasing the rush of proving something. And slowly, I started to feel something I hadn't felt since my very first trade. Peace. Not because I'd achieved some massive milestone, but because I'd finally learned to trust that small wins were enough. More than enough, in fact. They were the foundation I'd been missing all along. Chapter 10. Losing without losing myself. For a long time, every loss felt like a personal failure. No matter how small it was. No matter how clearly it fit within my plan. If the trade closed red, I'd sit there with that familiar heaviness in my chest. The voice that whispered, "See? You still don't really know what you're doing." It was the same voice that had driven me to overtrade, to chase, to swing for the fences. The same voice that told me I needed to prove something every single day. When I started rebuilding, I knew I had to find a way to quiet that voice. Because no matter how disciplined my plan was, if I couldn't accept losses without imploding, I'd always end up back where I started. The first step was learning to separate the loss from my identity. I remember one morning, I took a trade that followed every rule I'd committed to. I waited for my setup. I sized appropriately. I placed my stop exactly where I'd planned. And still, it lost. A clean, ordinary, statistically predictable loss. But when I closed it, the old wave of shame rushed up. My hands went cold. My thoughts started to spiral. What's wrong with you? Why can't you get this right? How many times are you going to fail before you finally quit? I almost believed it. But then I did something I'd never done before. I read the trade back in my journal, slowly, like I was reading about someone else. When I finished, I asked myself out loud, what, exactly, did I do wrong? The answer was nothing. I hadn't broken my rules. I hadn't sized up. I hadn't chased. The trade just didn't work out. That was all. And for the first time, I felt the smallest sliver of compassion for myself. Because if I was willing to accept that no setup wins every time, why was I holding myself to a standard of perfection? That realization didn't make the loss feel good. But it made it feel normal. And that was progress. Over the next weeks, I practiced losing. Not dramatically. Not in some heroic way. Just in small, boring doses. I'd take a trade, respect my stop, and close it without commentary. I'd feel the familiar pang of disappointment, but I stopped making it mean anything about who I was. It was just information. A cost of doing business. Little by little, I started to see the difference between losing and failing. Losing is inevitable. Failing is what happens when you let the loss define you. When you let it convince you that you're unworthy, incompetent, irredeemable. One day, after 3 losing trades in a row, I closed my platform and went for a walk. In the past, I would have sat there for hours, obsessing over every tick, searching for some mistake that would make it all make sense. But this time, I didn't. I let it be what it was. A day when the probabilities didn't favor me. Nothing more. Nothing less. It sounds simple when I say it now. But in that moment, it felt revolutionary. Because for the first time, I realized I didn't have to lose myself every time I lost a trade. I didn't have to spiral into shame. I didn't have to make it mean anything about my worth. Losing without losing myself became my new goal. More important than any profit target. More important than any single win. Because I knew if I could master that, the rest would take care of itself. Trading didn't feel easier after that. But it felt less like a referendum on my value. And in that space, I finally started to see what real resilience looked like. Not the ability to avoid losses. But the ability to absorb them without collapsing. Chapter 11. Redefining success. There was a time when success meant only one thing to me. Winning. It didn't matter how I did it. It didn't matter if I followed my plan or broke every rule in desperation. If I ended the day with more money than I started, I called it a victory. And for a while, that mindset almost worked. Until it didn't. When the losses finally caught up with me, they didn't just take my money. They took my illusions. They forced me to look at the parts of myself I'd been hiding behind my pandal. And when I started over, I knew I couldn't define success the same way anymore. Because the old definition was a trap. It kept me stuck in cycles of shame and overcompensation. It made every day feel like a test I was destined to fail. I remember one morning, a few months into rebuilding, I had what most traders would call a terrible day. 2 trades, both losers. No big mistakes. No revenge trading. Just a morning when the setups didn't work out. By my old standards, it would have been a failure. Proof that I was still incompetent. But as I sat there staring at my journal, I felt something surprising. A quiet sense of pride. Because I had followed every rule. I had respected every stop. I had walked away exactly when I promised I would. And for the first time, I realized that was success. Not the result. The process. That was the day I started redefining what it meant to win. I decided that success wasn't about ending the day green. It was about ending the day knowing I hadn't betrayed myself. I started writing a question at the end of each session. Did I do what I said I would do? If the answer was yes, I called it a successful day. Even if the balance was negative. Especially if it was negative. Because those were the days when discipline mattered most. Redefining success didn't make me immune to disappointment. There were still days when I wanted to slam my fist on the desk and scream. Days when I felt the old urge to chase and prove and recover. But little by little, the question in my mind shifted. I stopped asking, how much did I make? And started asking, how well did I trade? That shift changed everything. Because when you measure yourself by your process instead of your outcomes, you stop needing every day to be perfect. You stop feeling like a failure when the market doesn't cooperate. You stop putting your worth on the line every time you click the mouse. I remember one week in particular when I ended 5 straight sessions in the red. A year earlier, I would have spiraled. I would have chased trades, increased size, done anything to claw my way back to green. But instead, I stuck to my rules. I took the trades my plan allowed. And I walked away when the losses hit my limit. At the end of that week, I looked at my account and felt something I never thought I'd associate with a drawdown. Respect. Respect for the part of me that had finally learned to stay steady. Respect for the discipline that held when everything in me wanted to panic. Redefining success didn't make trading easy. But it made it sustainable. Because I no longer needed every day to validate my identity. I didn't need to be the best. I just needed to be consistent. And in that consistency, I started to build something I'd never had before. Trust in myself. I used to think trading was about finding the right strategy. But now I see it clearly. Trading is about finding the right standards. The ones that keep you grounded when nothing else feels certain. Chapter 12. Rebuilding confidence one trade at a time. After redefining what success meant to me, I thought confidence would come back overnight. I imagined I'd feel different right away. Steadier, braver, more sure of myself. But the truth was, confidence didn't return in a rush of clarity. It came back in pieces. One small, disciplined trade at a time. At first, it felt almost ridiculous to call what I was doing rebuilding. I wasn't trading big size. I wasn't making impressive profits. I was taking trades so modest that old me would have laughed. But those small, quiet trades were where I learned the most important lesson. Confidence isn't something you wait to feel before you act. It's something you earn by acting the way you promised you would, over and over, until the fear starts to fade. I remember one morning when everything in me wanted to prove I was back to being a winner. The market was moving fast. I saw setups forming, and the old voice came alive in my head. This is your chance to make up for everything you lost. For a moment, I almost listened. Almost threw the plan out the window and reverted to the person I used to be. But instead, I took one small trade. Sized exactly as my rules said. Managed exactly as I'd practiced. It wasn't a big winner. Just a modest profit, the kind that doesn't make for exciting stories. But when I closed it, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Calm. That single trade didn't restore my confidence all at once. But it was the first brick in a foundation I could finally trust. From that day on, I made a decision. I would stop searching for the moment when I'd feel perfectly ready. I would stop waiting for the day I woke up with unshakable certainty. I'd build confidence in tiny increments instead. Trade by trade. Session by session. Some days, the fear still came back. The fear that I'd never fully recover. That I'd always be the person who blew up 6 accounts. But every time I followed my process despite that fear, the volume of those doubts turned down a little more. It's funny. I used to think confidence was about results. About proving to myself that I could win big. But real confidence is something different. It's knowing you can trust yourself to act with integrity, no matter what the outcome is. One week, I ended up barely green overall. A handful of small wins, a few small losses. Nothing remarkable. But I remember closing my platform that Friday and feeling more solid than I ever did after a big profit. Because I hadn't broken any rules. I hadn't chased. I hadn't tried to force anything. I just traded. Patiently. Consistently. Honestly. And in that consistency, I felt something growing. A sturdier kind of belief in myself. Not the brittle, inflated confidence I used to have. The kind that only lasted as long as I was winning. But a quiet certainty that I could handle whatever the market threw at me. Rebuilding confidence wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a single triumphant moment. It was hundreds of small decisions to honor my process. To choose discipline over impulse. To respect small wins and ordinary days. I used to think that after so many failures, confidence was something I'd never feel again. But it came back. Not because I earned it in one big swing. But because I proved to myself, over and over, that I could be trusted. And when you trust yourself, everything else starts to feel possible again. Chapter 13. Finding joy in the process. For so long, I believed that joy in trading was reserved for the big moments. The streaks of green days. The sudden leaps in my account balance. The times when I could say, without hesitation, I'm winning. But the further I got from those early illusions, the more I began to realize something surprising. The moments that felt the most fulfilling weren't the ones that looked impressive from the outside. They were the quiet, ordinary days when I was simply doing what I said I would do. It didn't happen all at once. At first, I still found myself craving the excitement. I'd open my charts and feel the old hunger in my chest. That longing for something dramatic to prove I was back, that I was worthy again. But the more I focused on my process, the more that craving began to fade. Because the truth is, trading isn't meant to be thrilling every day. It's meant to be methodical. Measured. Even a little boring. And in that steadiness, I started to feel something I hadn't felt in years. Joy. Not the adrenaline rush of a big win. Not the relief of erasing a loss. But the deeper satisfaction of knowing I was finally practicing my craft with respect. I remember one morning when I didn't take a single trade. I spent hours watching the market, waiting for my setup. Nothing materialized. Old me would have forced something. Anything. To feel productive. But instead, I closed my platform and went for a walk. And as I walked, I felt light. Content in a way I couldn't explain. Because for the first time, not trading felt like a choice instead of a failure. That day taught me that joy doesn't always come from action. Sometimes, it comes from restraint. From knowing you don't have to be in the market to feel legitimate. That you don't need constant validation to feel like a trader. Over time, I started to look forward to the ordinary days. The sessions when I took one small trade and logged off. The weeks when my pendulum barely moved. Because those were the days I was building something real. Consistency, self-trust, and a kind of quiet pride that didn't depend on anyone's approval. It's funny. If you'd told me at the start that trading would feel like this, I probably would have thought you were trying to scare me off. I wanted the drama. I wanted the proof that I was extraordinary. But that need had cost me everything. And it was only when I let go of it that I started to find joy in the process itself. I started writing a new phrase at the top of my journal each morning. Today, I will respect the work. Not chase excitement. Not manufacture meaning out of every tick. Just respect the work. Some days, that meant showing up and doing nothing. Other days, it meant taking my setup and accepting the result without flinching. Every day, it meant proving to myself that trading could be sustainable. And even joyful. If I stopped trying to make it something it wasn't. I used to think trading would fill the empty places in me. That the highs of winning would erase every doubt I carried. But I've learned that the real joy comes from something much simpler. Knowing you've chosen integrity over impulse. Discipline over ego. And in that choice, you've become the kind of person you always hoped you could be. If you ask me what success looks like now, I'd tell you it's not about the big wins. It's about waking up every day excited to practice your craft. Not because you need it to prove anything, but because you've finally learned to love the process. Chapter 14. The day it all felt different. It wasn't a huge win that showed me I'd changed. It wasn't some perfect week where everything went my way. It was a day that looked, on paper, entirely unremarkable. I woke up early, made my coffee, and sat down in front of the charts the same way I always did. I felt calm. Present. Not anxious to prove anything. Not desperate to feel something big. Just ready to do the work. The market opened quietly. Price drifted back and forth without much conviction. I waited. In the past, that waiting would have driven me crazy. I would have seen the stillness as a threat. Proof that I wasn't progressing fast enough. But that day, I felt no urgency. It was just another morning. Another opportunity to practice what I'd spent so long learning. Eventually, my setup appeared. A clean signal, the kind I'd learned to trust without second guessing. I entered the trade. My heart beat a little faster, but there was no panic behind it. Just focus. I managed the position exactly as my plan dictated. When it stopped out for a small loss, I closed the platform and felt nothing. Not the old flood of shame. Not the compulsion to find a new trade immediately. Not the story that I'd failed. Just clarity. I sat there for a while, hands folded in my lap, noticing the absence of all the old noise in my head. The quiet felt almost unfamiliar. Like walking into a room I used to avoid and realizing it wasn't dangerous after all. That was when it hit me. I'd finally stopped fighting the market. And myself. I realized I wasn't measuring my value by what happened on the screen anymore. I wasn't hoping every session would validate me. I was just trading. Respecting risk. Respecting process. Respecting myself. It's hard to explain how profound that felt, even though nothing dramatic had happened. It was the first time I understood, in my bones, that the real transformation wasn't about outcomes. It was about identity. For so long, I believed I was only as good as my last trade. That every red day was an indictment of my worth. That every win was a temporary reprieve from my own self-doubt. But sitting there in the quiet, I knew those beliefs had finally lost their power. That evening, I took a walk. No headphones, no podcast about trading, no replaying the day over and over. Just me and the feeling that something had shifted. I didn't need the market to prove anything anymore. I didn't need it to fill the spaces in me I hadn't learned to fill myself. When I got home, I opened my journal and wrote. Today felt different. I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to. Because I knew exactly what that sentence meant. It meant that I could finally be trusted with this work. That I'd earned a kind of self-respect that wasn't contingent on the next trade going my way. It meant that after all the chaos, all the accounts I'd blown, all the nights I'd spent wondering if I was cut out for this, I'd found something real. Not invincibility. Not perfection. Just steadiness. That was the day I stopped seeing trading as a test I had to pass. And started seeing it as a practice I was committed to for the long haul. A craft I could keep refining, one honest day at a time. If I could go back to that first version of me. The one who believed winning was the only thing that mattered. I'd tell him this. One day, you'll have a session that looks like nothing from the outside. No big profit. No dramatic turnaround. But when it's over, you'll realize you've finally become the person you were trying so hard to pretend to be. And it won't feel like a finish line. It will feel like a beginning. Chapter 15. What losing gave me. I used to think losing took everything from me. My confidence. My identity. My belief that I was special. In those early days, every drawdown felt like a personal attack. Every red day felt like proof that I'd been fooling myself all along. I thought if I could just avoid losing, I'd finally feel secure. But the more I tried to run from it, the more it followed me. It took blowing up multiple accounts, sitting in more shame than I knew I could feel, and rebuilding from nothing over and over before I finally understood the truth. Losing didn't ruin me. It refined me. When I look back now, I see that every loss gave me something I couldn't have gotten any other way. The first losses showed me where my ego was hiding. They stripped away the illusions that I was in control of everything. They humbled me in ways winning never could. Losing taught me patience. Because you can't force the market to bend to your will, no matter how clever you think you are. It taught me respect. Because every time I broke my own rules to chase a feeling, the market reminded me exactly why those rules existed. But the most important thing losing gave me was honesty. Before I lost, I thought I could trade my way out of insecurity. That if I just made enough money, all the doubts and fears would evaporate. I was wrong. It wasn't until I faced my worst moments. Those days when everything I'd built fell apart. That I finally stopped pretending. I started to see that no amount of winning would ever be enough if I didn't change who I was underneath the trades. If I didn't learn to separate my worth from my outcomes. If I didn't practice discipline, not as a tactic to get rich, but as a commitment to respecting the work itself. Losing taught me that resilience isn't built in the good times. It's built in the quiet aftermath of failure, when you're sitting alone with your regrets and deciding to try again anyway. There was a moment, not long ago, when I looked at my account balance and realized it no longer made my chest tighten. I wasn't measuring my value by the number on the screen. I wasn't waiting for the market to tell me I was good enough. I was just doing the work. Calmly. Patiently. Honestly. It struck me then that losing had given me exactly what I'd been chasing all along. Not the thrill of feeling important. Not the validation of a big win. But the quiet confidence that I could trust myself, no matter what the outcome was. I used to think I'd look back on my biggest losses and feel only regret. But I don't. I feel gratitude. Because without those failures, I never would have learned how to trade without fear. How to sit with discomfort without reacting. How to close the platform at the end of the day and still respect the person I saw in the mirror. What losing taught me that winning never could is that real success isn't about never falling down. It's about learning to stand up over and over, each time a little steadier. A little less afraid. A little more honest. If you're in the middle of your own losses right now, I know how dark it can feel. How convincing the story is that you'll never figure it out. But I promise you this. If you stay curious. If you let those losses teach you instead of define you. They will give you something you can't get any other way. They will show you who you are without the mask. And when you see that clearly, you'll finally have a chance to become the trader. And the person you've always hoped you could be. If you've listened this far, maybe you've seen pieces of your own story in mine. The first intoxicating wins that made you feel unstoppable. The losses that cracked your certainty wide open. The desperate scrambles to prove you were still worthy of this path. I used to think trading was about finding a strategy no one else had. But the longer I've done this, the more I've realized the real work isn't in the charts. It's in the mirror. Because trading has a way of showing you every hidden part of yourself. The parts that crave validation. The parts that are terrified of being ordinary. The parts that would rather blow up an account than sit in the discomfort of being wrong. I've learned, slowly and painfully, that losing is not the enemy. Avoiding the lessons inside those losses is. If you're in a season of drawdowns right now, if you're sitting in your own version of the ruins, I want you to hear this. You are not defined by your last trade. You are not the sum of your biggest mistakes. You are simply a person learning something hard. And that's enough. If there's one thing I'd invite you to take from my story, it's this. Don't waste your energy trying to prove you're special. Use that energy to build something sustainable. Something you can trust. Something you can be proud of even when the results aren't impressive. Before you click away, I'd like to ask you to make a small commitment to yourself. Think about one habit you know is holding you back. One place where you keep choosing ego over discipline. Write it down somewhere you can see it. And if you feel brave, share it in a comment. Sometimes, saying it out loud is the first step to finally letting it go. Thank you for spending this time with me. Thank you for letting me share what losing taught me. Lessons I couldn't have learned any other way. I hope, wherever you are in your journey, you remember this. Your worth isn't measured in points or percentages. It's measured by your willingness to learn, to get honest, and to begin again. Every day you choose to do that is a day you're already succeeding.